The RiverLife Invasive project is a continuation of the 4th Invasive Non-Native Species project, which works on controlling the invasive species all through the 4th district. So there's 12 rivers in total for that project, but we focus on the River Almond and the River Avon for the RiverLife project. And we basically ask for volunteers and for communities to come out with us and treat some of the riparian invasive species that are found, trying to create a bit more habitat diversity in areas where invasive species have taken over. So the main 3 invasive species that we treat for the RiverLife project are Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed and Himalayan balsam.
So this is Himalayan Balsam, Passions glandulifera. It's a very invasive, very common plant found around rivers in Scotland and throughout the rest of the UK. Himalayan Balsam in particular is incredibly good at spreading itself, partly due to the explosive dispersal system of the seed pods, which you can see here. And if I can get one to go off in the right direction, there we go. So basically anytime anything brushes against these, strong gust of wind, it just fires its seeds all over the bank into the river that we're standing next to and disperses throughout. And it's incredibly difficult to manage, not least because of that. So I'm standing next to a couple of very common invasive species along UK waterways. So we have Japanese knotweed here, Fallopian japonica, and just in front of me a few kind of straggly Himalayan balsam plants, Passions glandulifera. Both a pretty significant ecological issue along the waterways they invade, but slightly different in the way they do so, and also slightly different in terms of some of the invertebrate fauna that they'll support and also the conditions that they create at the site. So Japanese knotweed in particular has pretty large leaves, pretty big surface area. So when you have a very dense canopy of that on a riverbank, you often find the temperatures a little higher within that stand, and also that provides quite a bit of shading both on the ground below and also because it overhangs the river, provides kind of a shaded margin which can create some sort of small habitats for invertebrates and fish. One of the main differences between the 2 plants is the Japanese knotweed itself. It's quite a hardy plant. I mean, it's quite a thick woody stem. Himalayan balsam has an incredibly weak, incredibly shallow root system, and so when frost hits towards sort of the end of summer, beginning of autumn, this plant just completely dies off. The leaves are really weak, kind of like degraded lettuce. You know, it's just there's no structure to them at all. The plants are just killed back by the frost, and then you're just left with an exposed riverbank. Knotweed is much the same, except you tend to be left with a lot of sticks, kind of like this dead plant behind me. It's a good example of the sort of vegetation structure that we'll see in the winter at a site invaded by Japanese knotweed. And of course the main issue is that they really exclude a lot of our native vegetation. So Japanese knotweed in particular comes up really quickly, shades out a lot of the slower growing native plants that we find along our waterways, and you might think that something that just kind of explodes up like this is only going to have a short-term impact, but actually we find, especially with a big kind of monoculture stand like this, it will continue to die back and regrow quickly the following year, and without some sort of management intervention on a repeated scale, you know, we're talking yearly treatments, this will just continue to grow back, and this will be all you'll see along the riverways, and the same for Himalayan balsam as well.
Japanese knotweed itself has been the main problem on the River Almond and Avon so far. Giant hogweed is found on the River Almond quite extensively around about the Gogarburn area, and we've tried to treat it now for several years. We're having a big impact on the extent of giant hogweed down near the airport stretch of the River Almond, and I think we're making a big difference. You see less of it around now. Giant hogweed came over from Asia. Again, it's all of these species are found from the Victorian era, basically, where they came over for planted in nice ornamental gardens, basically. And we find that it has escaped the gardens and uses the river as a vector for travelling, culturing along. It's a nice little road for it to take over.
So For a student like myself who's spent the last 4 years studying invasive species like this, one of the, I guess, most dangerous from a scientific point of view, things that we have to deal with is actually the rise of something that we refer to as invasive species denialism. So, I mean, I'm quite clearly surrounded by some fairly well-established invasive plants. I would struggle to look at these and say that we don't have an invasive species problem. But there is some, there's been a rise over the past 20 years, certainly an exponential rise in the number of articles that aren't necessarily peer-reviewed. We're talking kind of emotive journalism, books that don't go through the same peer review process that perhaps papers in academic journals will do, that put articles out saying, invasive species aren't a problem, we don't need to worry about them. It's just nature's way of being wild and just nature being nature, life will find a way, that kind of approach. And that spending any money, any time, any effort on treating these plants is just a waste of time. And the reason that's really dangerous is that this isn't a natural state. From an ecological point of view, it's an absolute nightmare. And it's an absolute nightmare for rivers and fisheries trusts who want to spend money and time and resources treating plants like this, and they just simply don't have the funding allocated to them to treat them. And this isn't a quick fix. You can't just come along with, I don't know, a hedge trimmer and just cut all the plants down and say, well, job done, they're all dead. Because they will just come back, harder, better, stronger the next year, and will continue to do so. And really the only kind of tried and tested method of treating plants like this is a year-on-year approach where you absolutely hammer them. So one of the commonly used herbicides is glyphosate for Japanese knotweed behind me, and you have to either spray or stem inject the larger plants to kill them off. And it's really not enough to do that for 1 year or 2 years. We're talking 5 years. There are some studies that have suggested 10 years. But the more articles that come out that suggest that plants like this aren't an issue and that we should just let nature be nature, the more likely it is, I think, that funding bodies are kind of going to side with that narrative. And in the absence of evidence that shows that these plants have a really negative effect on their environment, funding is just going to keep collapsing. And we're going to get anglers coming along saying, well, I don't want to pay to fish these rivers because I can't get down to the riverbank because there's 10 foot of Japanese knotweed I can't get through. And it's just I struggle to see anything like this as anything other than negative, really. And I think the huge benefit with projects such as my own, which is funded by Scottish Natural Heritage, and which is a brilliant thing to be doing. We're really trying to get some evidence together and sort of prove that plants like this have a really negative effect on native vegetation, on our native invertebrates, both terrestrially and in the waterways, and also on some of the larger fauna that people are more familiar with. So brown trout and Atlantic salmon that use these rivers both to spawn and as nursery streams. If we're changing the makeup of the vegetation, we're changing how much of the river is shaded by vegetation, we're changing the invertebrates that we're finding in the river and on the river banks that might fall into the river that these fish will use in their diet. You could suggest that that's probably going to be having or potentially having an effect on them as well. So there's a huge amount to consider.
The benefit for volunteering for the RiverLife invasive species project would be that you see a difference on the river. We would package it as it's a good day out. I mean, it's a physical job, but it is a good day out along the river, where you get to see lots of different native habitats that you may find if you were not to be as caring about invasive species, or if you let things get out of control, these habitats would disappear. Volunteers and communities are an essential part of treating invasive riparian species. It's a more sustainable approach. You have large areas. If you tackle invasive species on a catchment scale, which you're supposed to, as is a top-down approach, you want to be able to have these people who are able to go out and control their local stretches. So we train all of our volunteers up. Basically, we do the general risk assessments of invasive species. Each one has their own problems. For example, giant hogweed is renowned for its ability to burn and blister skin. So people need to be aware of this before they go out and try to control it. We also want to be able to train our volunteers up in management and control. One, to make sure that they know what the invasive species are that they're treating and they're not treating a native species. Two, there's a kind of legislation involved around about controlling these with herbicides and pesticides. So we have to put our volunteers through these training courses so they know how to use them legally. And it also gives them a lifetime qualification to use.
My name's John Clayton. I work for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, who allow us 1 day a year for volunteering. And I work as an ecologist, and I manage the ecologists in the south of Scotland from the Galashiels and Dumfries offices. A lot of our work is associated with the river network, mainly the Tweed and its tributaries. Under the Water Framework Directive, we want to get all rivers to good or high status. So anything that's inhibiting them from getting to that status, we try and take measures to remove. And it's perhaps a lot more difficult than you might imagine, because classification's based on a whole range of different parameters, and you just need one to be falling below the good status, and that downgrades the river. So sometimes it's picking them off a few at a time, but last year's classification we were sitting at 64% of rivers in good or high status, so we're 2/3 of the way there.
And the volunteers who come back year after year, we are so amazed by that they can do this to themselves every year. Our volunteers are fully aware of everything that goes on, and we're so very grateful for all of the effort that they put in.